Why is a city with barely 2,000 Filipino residents producing crowds that look like 250,000 people have shown up? And why are the people who cover tennis for a living among the most visibly stunned by what is happening? Why does the tournament's 17th seed, a player who has a losing record against both of her potential second-round opponents, already have fans gathering outside the practice courts before she has even hit a single ball? And why does one of the most respected doubles legends in tennis keep bringing up her name as if she is watching something unfold that even she cannot fully explain? Yet something extraordinary is happening in Mason, Ohio, and by the end of the story, you'll understand exactly why it doesn't make sense on paper and why that may be the most important part of all. Picture the Lindner Family Tennis Center on a morning that should be quiet. Cincinnati is supposed to be the calm before the storm, the final major stop before New York, a tournament where players fine-tune their games in relative peace before the chaos of the US Open takes over. But this year, there is no peace. Lines are forming before the gates, even open cameras are everywhere, and something has completely changed the atmosphere around the tournament. There are people pressed against the fencing around the practice courts, phones raised, waiting for a glimpse of a woman who hasn't even started her tournament yet. And this is where the story stops making sense, because the obvious explanation doesn't quite work. Normally, when a WTA event suddenly explodes with this kind of energy, there's a simple reason: a massive local community, a country with a huge diaspora living in that city, showing up to support one of their own. The flags, the chants, the pride of watching someone who shares their roots compete on a major stage. Toronto had exactly that. The city is home to more than 270,000 Filipinos, one of the largest Filipino communities outside the Philippines. So, when Alex Eala played there and the arena felt like a home crowd, it made perfect sense. But Cincinnati is different. There is no massive built-in Filipino army waiting outside the gates. The local Filipino population is estimated to be somewhere around 1,000 to 2,000 people. Think about that difference for a moment. Toronto's Filipino community was roughly 250 times larger, yet somehow the same phenomenon is beginning to happen in Cincinnati, and that is what makes this story so difficult to explain. And yet the energy right now, according to people who were physically there in both cities, feels almost identical. That is not a small discrepancy. It is the kind of difference that should make this phenomenon almost impossible to explain, and that is exactly why people inside the sport are so stunned, because they have spent years learning what normal crowd behavior looks like, and this is anything but normal. This is something else entirely. So, let's rewind, because to understand why Cincinnati is suddenly losing its mind over a player it has almost no demographic reason to support, you have to understand what happened before Alex Eala ever set foot in Ohio. It begins with a comeback that at one point seemed almost impossible. Just a few weeks earlier, in the middle of a physically brutal and emotionally exhausting summer swing, Alex captured her first WTA Tour title in Washington, D.C. at a tournament most casual tennis fans probably wouldn't have circled on their calendars. It wasn't supposed to be her moment, but somewhere along that tournament, something changed. What followed was a dramatic comeback title run that culminated in an emotional post-match interview with Alex breaking down in tears after defeating a former Wimbledon champion. That moment didn't just give her a trophy, it gave people a reason to start paying attention, a moment so raw that it stopped being just a tennis clip and became something people who don't even follow tennis started sharing. That was the first domino. Then came Toronto, and this is where the story began to feel less like a rising player having a good month and more like the early stages of a phenomenon that nobody had fully recognized yet. Alex Eala reached the fourth round of the National Bank Open, but it was what happened around her that became impossible to ignore. The crowd response was so intense that Alex herself later went on Instagram and compared the atmosphere to a Filipino neighborhood gathering back home, describing the noise and chaos inside the 12,500-seat arena as something closer to the electric-packed atmosphere of a community basketball league final. Think about the weight of that comparison. She wasn't describing a polite tennis crowd clapping between points. She was describing something much closer to a hometown celebration transplanted thousands of miles away from where she grew up. And then came the detail that really makes you stop and think. Even her opponents began noticing it after defeating Alex in Toronto. A former world number 4 openly acknowledged that most of the crowd had clearly been supporting Alex, while still thanking the fans for creating such an incredible atmosphere. Sit with that for a moment. A player who had just won her own match still felt compelled to recognize that the overwhelming energy inside the stadium belonged to the woman she had just beaten. That tells you just how powerful the Alex Eala phenomenon had already become. That's not normal tournament energy, that's something closer to gravity, a pull strong enough to bend the entire room even when she loses. And now you understand why Cincinnati should have been the quiet chapter, the palate cleanser, the tournament where statistically none of that emotional intensity should have followed her, because the local numbers simply aren't there to sustain it, and yet somehow it followed her anyway. Which brings us to Rennie Stubbs, a name that carries serious weight in the tennis world. She has watched decades of players rise, fall, and disappear, and she has seen manufactured hype collapse under its own weight more times than she could probably count. But when Stubbs talks about Alex Eala, she doesn't speak about her like a temporary flash in the pan. Instead, she frames Cincinnati as the next real test, a chance to prove that Washington and Toronto weren't simply a lucky, repeatable stretch, but the beginning of something sustainable. And then comes the part that should really make you pause: whether Alex goes deep in this tournament or not. More people are already talking about her than ever before inside the sport. There is a growing belief that she has the potential to bring an entirely new generation of fans into tennis, and if that happens, Cincinnati may not be witnessing a temporary wave at all. It may be watching the beginning of something much bigger. That is not a small thing to say. It is not casual praise. It is someone with decades of credibility looking at a story that is still developing and putting her reputation behind the idea that this is bigger than one hot month. But here is where the story takes a sharp and uncomfortable turn, because all of this adoration and crowd energy is building directly ahead of a match that could end Alex Eala's tournament almost before it begins. Alex enters Cincinnati as the 17th seed, earning a first-round bye and moving straight into the second round, where she will face either Poland's Magdala Linette or Romania's Elena Gabriela Ruse. And here is the part nobody in that growing crowd wants to think about: Alex does not currently have a winning record against either player. Start with the more dangerous scenario. If Ruse is waiting across the net, the history is brutal. Alex is winless against her, having lost in 3 tight and punishing sets during the 2024 US Open qualifying rounds. And Ruse is not simply dangerous because of history, she is dangerous because she is arriving with confidence. Just days earlier in Toronto, she produced a stunning comeback, fighting back from 4 games down in a set before eventually defeating an American opponent in 3 sets. That is not a player limping into Cincinnati. That is a player who has just reminded everyone that she thrives when a match appears to be slipping away. If she gets through to face Alex, Eala would not only be facing someone she has never beaten, she would be facing a player who has just proven once again that she can steal matches that look almost impossible to win now. Flipped to the other possibility, if Linette is waiting instead, the picture looks slightly more encouraging on the surface. The two have split their 4 career meetings, and Alex has won their last 2 encounters, including victories at the ASB Classic and Miami Open. That sounds like momentum until you look further back. Linette won their previous 2 meetings in Abu Dhabi in 2024 and Nottingham in 2025, and there is another detail that makes her impossible to underestimate. Earlier in 2026, Linette defeated a 5-time Grand Slam champion at the Miami Open. She is a 34-year-old veteran who has already shown this season that she can rise to the occasion when the moment demands it. So underneath all the excitement surrounding those fans outside the practice courts is a very real tension. They are not showing up because Alex's result feels guaranteed. They are showing up despite knowing that on paper this match could end in heartbreak, and that changes the meaning of this crowd completely. This is not blind fandom built around an expected victory. These are people choosing to be there anyway, because somewhere along the way, watching Alex compete stopped being only about the final score and became about something much bigger. There is another layer that makes this Cincinnati moment even more significant. This is Alex's first time actually competing at this tournament. She was scheduled to play here last year, but a shoulder injury forced her to withdraw before she ever got the chance. So beneath the crowds, beneath the difficult draw, and beneath all the attention, There is a quiet personal milestone unfolding, a Cincinnati debut coming immediately after the best month of her career and one of the most physically demanding stretches she has ever endured. Nearly 2 straight weeks of high-level, high-pressure tennis led into her Canadian Open exit, followed by very little recovery time before arriving in Ohio. Her team has been working around the clock to manage the physical toll. And Alex has been open about how much she values simply staying healthy right now, treating her health as one of the most important priorities on her list. She is not walking into Cincinnati fresh. She is walking and carrying momentum, expectations, exhaustion, and an entire crowd that has somehow decided that her journey is worth showing up for even when nobody can guarantee what happens next. She is walking into Cincinnati running on fumes, and the fans lining up before sunrise seem to understand that completely. They're showing up anyway, treating every practice session as if it matters just as much as the match itself. But to understand why that support has become so powerful, you have to understand where Alex Eala actually came from, because her background completely reframes everything you have just heard. This is a player who grew up training on courts with cracks running through the surface, gaps in the nets, and no proper fencing to stop a stray ball from rolling into the street. In a country with very limited infrastructure for producing professional tennis players, let alone someone capable of competing at the highest level of the sport. This is not the polished academy origin story we usually hear about elite athletes. It is raw, difficult, and deeply unconventional, and perhaps that is exactly why her rise has connected so strongly with people. When someone climbs from limited resources to the biggest stages in the sport, fans are not simply watching a talented athlete, they are watching someone overcome obstacles in real time, and they begin to feel like they are part of that journey. That kind of story can create an emotional connection far stronger than ordinary sports fandom. And when reporters have asked Alex about the crowds that have transformed one North American tournament after another into something resembling a home match, she repeatedly comes back to the same idea: the support is not really about her alone. In her eyes, it represents something bigger than one player, something that continues to grow alongside her from city to city. And perhaps that is the real reason the crowds keep following her, because they are not just watching Alex Eala win tennis matches, they are watching a story they feel belongs to them too. That kind of framing matters more than people realize. A player who pushes the spotlight outward instead of keeping it all for herself tends to build a relationship with an audience that doesn't simply fade. It multiplies. Now zoom all the way out, because there is one detail that becomes genuinely fascinating when you think about it for more than a few seconds. Tennis fandom has traditionally been built around proximity. Historically, when a player attracts a massive crowd in a foreign city, there is usually an obvious explanation. That city has a large population from the player's home country. Local organizations have spent years building connections with that community. Tickets are promoted within it, and generations of families show up because supporting one of their own has become part of the culture. Alex doesn't have any of that in Cincinnati. There are no decades of infrastructure behind her, no established tradition of thousands of local fans gathering to watch her. She has had only months, just a handful of months of breakthrough results. One viral emotional interview, one dramatic comeback title, one unforgettable run in Toronto, and somehow that has already been enough to create an atmosphere that resembles cities with hundreds of thousands of potential supporters. That is not a fan base she inherited, it is one she is building in real time, tournament by tournament, directly in front of everyone. And if you are wondering why that distinction matters, here is the answer. Community-driven support is incredibly powerful, but by definition it is geographically limited. It appears where the community already exists. Crossover fandom is different. It follows the person, not the population. It appears in cities where there may be almost no built-in connection to the player, simply because people have decided they want to watch that athlete, support that athlete, and become part of the story. It is the same phenomenon that turns superstar athletes into global figures far beyond the borders of their home countries, and once a player crosses that line, the potential audience becomes dramatically larger. Which brings us to the next chapter, because New York is waiting. The US Open is approaching, and New York has one of the largest and most passionate Filipino communities in the United States. That community is vastly larger than what Alex encountered in Toronto, and worlds apart from the tiny Filipino population in Cincinnati. So, if a city with only a few thousand Filipino residents can already produce scenes that leave longtime tennis observers stunned. What happens when Alex walks onto a court in New York, surrounded by a community numbering in the hundreds of thousands, a community that already knows her story and understands exactly what she represents?